Welcome, my friends. We're here today to talk about something slightly different. We're not here to talk about a specific area of the law, but rather a sociological aspect of the law, which would fit under criminology. We're here to talk about restorative justice, which is one of the many forms of methods of dealing with criminals that exist within England and Wales. Now, in our introduction, it must be said, the main question that we're going to be focusing on here is, how does restorative justice fit into the modern criminal justice system for England and Wales? What are the issues it is aimed at addressing? How effective is it at addressing these issues? And what is its future within England, the English and Welsh system, as well as what it might look like? Now, I've said a lot about restorative justice, but I haven't really explained it. So, restorative justice can be explained through its aims. According to the Crown Prosecution Service, the CPS, restorative justice falls into three forms. It's related to victim satisfaction. It relates to the idea of engagement by the perpetrator and the creation of community capital. This is the really important bit there, the community capital. You could essentially see it as a form of soft justice, where both the victims and the offender are engaged with negotiations of sort to come to a resolution which is more beneficial to everyone involved and helps to repair rather than punish their relationships. So, with the aims being made clear, you also must be aware that there are four distinctly different types of restorative justice that are currently in existence within our jurisdiction. Those are: 1. Direct/indirect restorative justice. 2. Community conferencing. 3. Referral order panels, so ROP. And 4. Mediation. The former two are most widely practiced, so that's the direct/indirect restorative justice and community conferencing, whereas the latter two, referral order panels and mediation, are lesser well known. With that being said, all four deal with the core idea that you must have a victim involved and an offender involved for both to be present, or at least have representative presence, for there to be a facilitator involved as well, and further to that, for a resolution to be jointly agreed by those involved that necessarily acts as a reparation for the crimes committed. So, with the first form of restorative justice, the direct or indirect process, it follows the above format, with the additional possibilities of supporters or community support being present, or the facilitator acting as a go-between. So, for example, if the victim and offender don't feel entirely comfortable with seeing each other, they could have a facilitator that goes from one party to another. As well as that, you might have additional people involved with the sort of process. So you might have a child present with their mother, also there to provide the community support. Or you might have someone who's well known in the community, like the local pastor, who's also present. That's the sort of process we're discussing here when we talk about DRRJ, direct and indirect restorative justice. However, when we start to think about the community conferencing, that's restorative justice. That's the former, but on a far wider scale. So this is where we kind of imagine in your head almost a mob situation. We're talking about lots of members of the community present, sitting up in something like a gallery, and they are involved with deciding the solution for the situation, in saying, okay, this child has offended, or this gentleman has committed this crime. As an entire people here, let's come up with how they could better help the entire community to make payments for what they have done. So that's what the community conferencing is. ROP, our third version, the referral order panels, are a restorative justice which is more focused on youth offenders. It takes the form of a post-trial direct and indirect restorative justice, where the victim is put in an advisory role whilst the experts in youth offending act as quasi-judges. So, slightly different system. In the former two, you have the victims very much acting as almost a judge or an equal level judge to the offender in coming to a resolution, whereas here we now have a legal expert of sorts is there to dish out the resolution. However, they are helped to form the idea of what that resolution should take by the victim's input, and seemingly no real input from the offender. Mediation, being our final version, is much more similar to our first example, the direct and indirect restorative justice, with the only difference that the facilitator has to be an objective third party rather than just an authority figure directly involved in the case. So when we talked about DIRJ, it would have been fairly acceptable for someone who is fairly senior ranking and possibly even biased to be involved in the case. However, in terms of mediation, our third party needs to be as unbiased as can be possible. So they might even be someone from out of town acting as facilitator. Now, by dividing restorative justice into our four types, we can begin to see how they are addressing issues related to justice. So MCJS is better able to select to reflect restorative justice that fit the appropriate crime, and in doing so the most benefit to those involved. It is easy to see then how direct/indirect and community conferencing could be used for close-knit communities. So what we're saying here is, imagine if you have a small village, there's only about 30 people living there. Everyone should know each other fairly well. If a crime is committed in that situation, then our close-knit community can come together and put the shame wheels, I'd say, on our offender and get them to step in line and do something that really helps everyone. So close-knit communities, rural areas, basically places where shame has a real strong impact on those who have committed the crime and can be readily used in the sentencing process. Given that England and Wales, apart from its gigantic megacities, is mostly a rural place, restorative justice can work incredibly well in these environments, and possibly even in the suburbs, though the suburbs themselves are far more wider in scope. But then again, when you're judging restorative justice integration, you need to also consider how it's been used in similar jurisdictions and how effective it's been for them. So in this example, I would like to compare Northern Ireland and Scotland to England and Wales. These are two population-wise smaller countries. However, they do have their own sort of problems. So Northern Ireland, for example, has always been a troubled land. It's had a long and not very fruitful history of criminal behaviour, which is very much the same as the rest of the UK. Yet here, restorative justice has been seen as a very strong success case. So to see how strong or how successful RJ has been in Northern Ireland, we need to look at 2001 and the situation between Northern Ireland and England and Wales at that time. So at that point in time, they were both in very similar positions. Both had high levels of crime, both had high levels of reoffending, and both had high youth reoffending rates. Yet from the period of 2001 to 2008, Northern Ireland saw its crime rates fall at a significant rate. this is compared to England and Wales, which actually saw crime rates increase over the same time, although this might have something to do with an increase in population that also occurred in that time span. It is well recorded that between the times of 2001 to 2008 there was a very substantial spike in migration from Europe. I don't know what you can say about linking those two, but the fact remains the same, that in this time period, while Northern Ireland brought down its crime rates, England and Wales brought them up. Some have claimed a number of reasons for this stark difference. So some have said it goes along youth offending and adult offending. So for England and Wales, there was extreme pressures, there was immigration, there was a hardening of public policy on crime. The opposite of this actually occurred elsewhere. So in Ireland, for example, this other jurisdiction, a reverse took place. There were softer policies put out towards crime. One example is the Justice Northern Ireland Act 1996 and the same one 2002, which respectively brought the idea of restorative justice into the system as an alternative to custodial sentencing. Custodial sentencing being time in prison. So even with that being said, present statistics provide that in Northern Ireland, as the use of restorative justice has grown, there has been a real sharp fall in recorded sentencing and reoffending. I actually printed a slide, a template, if you will, that had this data formed into a table. The table essentially says that of the 5% of youth conferencing accounted for, 39% were summary prosecutions. 2 years later on, youth conferencing had grown by 4%, yet summary prosecution had fallen to 10%. Basically, as more youth conferencing occurred, there was actually a fall in worst offender situations. The statistics show basically that there was a slight drop in summary prosecution, there was a increase in cautions, there was decrease in informal warnings, and youth conferencing actually increased. And with it, summary prosecution dropped, and it was only about 3% in some cases. So real big changes it brought about there, statistically speaking. At the same time, restorative justice was being implemented in Northern Ireland. It was suffering. The main cause it was being implemented to address was the unsustainable prison rates and the economic recession. So not a lot of money to go around anyway, and you don't want to be essentially spending your money on prisoners who aren't giving a lot back to the society you're trying to support, apart from their exclusion from society. England and Wales, again, was in a very similar situation. They need to come up with a cost-effective solution that would reduce crime rates and prison population. One reason it's proposed for this smooth transition and success in Northern Ireland was the ongoing transition at the time to do with reconciliation. So prior to 1997, we obviously know that there was something akin to a civil war, you could say, with the Troubles. There was massive civil unrest, and restorative justice became a symbol of the transition. No longer will there be so many hard line approaches. Now we will take these softer views. Now the system will be more respectful. And even more recently, there have been doubts over whether the declining rates are not just a result of poor reporting. Whatever the case may prove, this transitional change presents an interesting precedent for Scotland with the SNP, who underwent a similar transition from Labour. When they switched from Labour to the Scottish Nationalist Party, one of the things they did was perform radical policy shifts, including the integration of restorative justice programmes into their own judicial system, with similar results. In the years of 2013 to 14 and 2014 to 2015, which was the referendum period, the restorative justice recorded high levels of effectiveness. And this suggested that following after EU referendum, it is possible for England to equally undergo a restorative justice transition if it so pleased. What I'm saying here is Ireland had a big problem with crime. They weren't sure that they could shake the boat without drowning. However, during the time of the Good Friday arrangements, they used this as a chance to bring in restorative justice and had gleaned wonderful results from it. Equally, the Scottish Nationalist Party, when they took over from Labour, as a result of their radical stance and desire to change the system, they also introduced restorative justice. Looking at the numbers, you can actually see that the amount of adults who were reoffending decreased from 2008 and 2009 onwards. There was actually a steady increasing rate of crime, but then something happened in this time period, which is quite possibly our restorative justice, that saw declining rates. And among youth offenders, it was really massively declining rates, so low that it's probably a third of what they were in 2003. And that's when our economy was actually doing very well. So there you go. It's not all about money. It's not just saying we've got a lot of criminals because everyone was poor, because we're now getting less criminals than when everyone was rich. Anyway, England and Wales did try to pilot restorative justice. It attempted it in 2008. Now this is from a source of the Ministry of Justice from 2014. So whilst restorative justice has been at the forefront of government policy since 1998, and that's with the Criminal and Disorder Act 1998 in sections 67 to 72 in terms of reparation orders, it was the first real concerted effort to integrate restorative justice actually occurred in 2008, and this was following this same pilot scheme I'm about to describe. The results of those initial findings covered areas of London, Northumbria and Thames Valley. Primarily, London was to be your urban experiment, Northumbria was to be your suburban experiment, and the Thames Valley was to be your rural areas experiment. No doubt the pilot, if it was to see any merit, that would reinforce the idea that what happened in Northern Ireland wasn't a fluke of something outside restorative justice, but might have actually been caused by restorative justice. And if it could have been implemented effectively in the UK on those scales, that gave a lot of opportunity for it being implemented across the nation, and finally breaking this stalemate of the only way to solve a problem is to put it behind bars. The findings of that initial pilot program proved incredibly promising, especially among mid-tier crimes. So we're talking burglary, where the offender and the victim do not tend to come into direct contact, but it can result in that occurring. So this is not something perhaps that can be used with indictable crimes like murder or rape. However, it certainly is effective with things relating to theft and lower than that, where the criminal to some extent still wants their activities to be in the shadows, so can still feel shame for their acts. Now, these figures for Northern Ireland proved very promising. They showed 10 to 30% of youth and adult reoffenders dropping. So there was 10 to 30% drop in reoffender rates, which is what my graph that I have had shown. For the landmark reoffending levels fell actually by the tens of thousands in these areas. So while having criminals at all was still undesirable, it did show there had been a positive impact in these decisions. Unfortunately, the pilot itself only focused on the pre-trial stage, which is a very limited version of restorative justice. Remember, we've just spoken about 4 different types of restorative justice. When you focus on the pre-trial stage, that's really only part of the direct restorative justice. Some forms of restorative justice actually take place while the prisoner is in prison, where the victim visits them fairly regular in order to discover what can be done. Now, nothing is really done in the UK, or in England and Wales anyway, until 2012, when there's been a shift in policies towards restorative justice. Keep in mind, now we're in the age of the coalition for this, and this whole paper, by the way, has been written in 2016, just so we can carbon date it. So the policies changed towards restorative justice in 2012. This is shown in the Crime and Courts Act 2013 under Schedule 16 Part 2, where there was an inserted set of clauses which provided courts must give non-custodial sentences the rights of restorative justice. It's really quite significant that this statute demands this of judges, that they actively try to use restorative justice. It shows that on a public policy level, restorative justice is gaining traction. It also shows that one of the first requirements in Northern Ireland and Scotland for successful restorative justice is that it is implemented into statute in such a way. Now, while restorative justice has success, public opinions on the matter are rather lacking. Basically, for those who know, restorative justice works, but for those who don't know, they choose to believe it is some sort of mollycoddling to the criminals, and for that reason they don't want to do it. You and I were a bit more open-minded. Now, looking at 2013 onwards and this projection of a shifting pattern for England and Wales in terms of pre-sentencing, there was a paper written by the Ministry of Justice in 2014. It says that the most unexpected result of restorative justice has been the greater harm experienced. The more effective restorative justice can be going to say restorative justice is most effective with more serious offences at the pre-sentence stage. So basically, restorative justice does work. In terms of indictable offences, it also works as long as it's at the pre-trial stage and perhaps not later. It doesn't work 100% of the time, and for those it doesn't work for, some people really take it very badly, having to face, especially in rape crimes, the person who's delivered such harsh treatment to them. And this is something that the Restorative Justice paper by the Ministry of Justice highlights. It distinguishes these cases involving domestic abuse or hate crime as unsuitable for restorative justice just due to the nature of the crime, because the crime is a psychological element to it. It has a physical reinforcement of a feeling or emotion. Those two people involved, the offender and the victim, there's a reason why the offender does not like the victim. It's almost a personal attack. Same with domestic abuse. It just brings too much traumatic memories home and lack of repentance. Some forms of crime, those almost unbiased crimes you could say, where it's just a matter of wrong place, wrong time, those situations where it's not conditional on who you are or what you are, those types of crimes restorative justice can work very well with. And this as well shows more of this support from public policy. Now, given that pilot could not possibly have been predicted, and that the pilot proves public opinion is wrong on this matter, the new question is, how well should restorative justice be integrated on a more fuller scale and at all levels. Well, to address that issue, we've got to talk about the problems with integration. One is that the policy can only be effective if used as a grassroots collective action problem. So if you try to implement this policy and an area doesn't like it, you won't be able to admit it. It won't work in that area. It requires this adherence to two fundamental principles that without which it will fail. There must be a pre-sentence stage where restorative justice can be implemented, and this should be at the request of the police or the victim or the probation or the youth offending teams or the restorative justice providers. It must also adhere to the Victim Code 2013 for that particular case. The Victim Code, by the way, requires a mutual agreement to being involved in the process from the victim and the offender. What this has led to in the past has been many victims or offenders just opting out of the process, just saying, look, I know this might work, but I don't want to see the criminal, or the criminal going, I know I've done something wrong, I don't want to face up to my issues, I don't want to see this person, I don't want that on my head, I would rather serve my time and do it again than, face the lights. Because the criminal is actually quite simple, the courts these days. I mean, prison's not that great, but you can live, you can survive there. When you face a person, that's a bit of a curveball. Emotional connections can really hurt your mind. Northern Ireland, though, managed to get around this sort of obligation issues by just making it mandatory for most cases. Rather than saying, a victim or an offender can always say, you know what, I don't want to be involved. Northern Ireland said, hang on, if it's domestic violence, if it's, a rape case, something like that, yes, you have the choice to opt out. But if it's something that's really out of your hands, you're going to have to sit down. It's mandatory. Let's see how it goes. So, from there, we ended up with Parliament's expansion in Schedule 16, which is quite achievable, really, for England and Wales. There were other issues, though, apparently, especially with English and Wales, that prevented restorative justice from being implemented. And that was the practical data sharing. So one of the principal issues of sharing contract information that could facilitate the meetings would be the delays that would lead to the cancellation of restorative justice. As long as restorative justice, its effectiveness is reduced, both parties are unable to come to terms with themselves with the incident, then it hasn't worked. For restorative justice to work, it must be following an efficient process, and everyone on board must be on board. Now, from the feedback that victim offenders who were involved with this sort of process, from what they've said, even with the delayed restorative justice at pre-sentence stage, 72 reported it was delivered just in time, while 22 thought it could have been done sooner. So even where it has been used in England and Wales, most people agree it was a really close thing, and the restorative justice could have been far more effective in their cases if it was there from the beginning rather than coming in so late a stage in the game. What's abundantly clear then is at the pre-sentence stage there needs to be more experienced participants who are equipped and able to deal with a smooth transition of restorative justice. One of the problems then of restorative justice is just the facilitators are not familiar with the system, they're not familiar with how things are done, they take their time, they don't entirely think it will work, and the result is it doesn't always work. But for those who have used it, they wished we had people who were experienced and able to get the job going. Now, it could even be possible to achieve this smooth transition that many an English and Welsh person or native to this country has asked for. They could merely ask for these specialists from Northern Ireland who've been doing it a lot longer than we have to come over and help train our existing staff so that they can deliver restorative justice at a far more efficient and better standard. Equally, you could ask Scotland to come down and provide general practice guideline books as they have done for their own people, for England and Wales, and how they can be consulted before this process begins so that everything is smooth and everyone understands. But with that said, there's another hindrance to the pre-sentencing stage, and that's the reliance on the Victims' Code. As previously stated, the Victims' Code prevents a lot of cases from being resolved through restorative justice at a full integration stage. And for there to become a widespread awareness on the campaigns and the merits of restorative justice, it must be aimed at the citizenry and it must encourage participation. We know from Northern Ireland the easiest way to encourage participation is just to make it mandatory. In the UK, in England and Wales here, maybe we can't do the mandatory approach, however it must be more strongly emphasised among our people. Another problem with restorative justice has been implementing the new laws that expand what restorative justice can be done and providing this awareness to magistrates' courts, because most of those who are aware of the changes in restorative justice are barristers or solicitors who are hanging around in our superior courts or our high courts or our crown courts and county courts. However, most of these cases, the cases where restorative justice is most effective, are at the magistrate court level, and the fact that most magistrate courts don't have the training in this area deprives them in a great many ways of doing something which really can help the community. Looking forward from 2014, where there was again another sort of change in England and Wales, it was the integration of post-sentencing. So while pre-sentencing had its own issues to do with full integration, there was another set of issues that were even greater facing the post-sentencing role. So it emerged in the Offenders Rehabilitation Act 2014, Section 15, subsection 3, that restorative justice can go no further. That restorative justice must be left to the courts to decide. And the problem with this laissez-faire approach, this post-sentencing, is very easily falls foul of a time imperative. You can identify the same problem already existing with the pre-sentence stage. Imagine how much worse it can be when you have a post-sentence stage. You need to somehow bring together everything you'd been working on before and deliver it when the criminal's leaving. You don't want to spend any more money on him at that point in time. That's how the government, to an extent, sees it. Now, according to the Restorative Justice Council, it recommends, as a means to adjust this concern, that restorative justice be made automatically available where an offender has pleaded guilty. Where there is identifiable victims, restorative justice can be implemented from the very beginning. So what we're saying here is, rather than us all wasting time saying, oh, do you want to get involved? Do you want to get involved? Or saying, oh, it's mandatory for everyone, we just say, okay, that guy's the victim, he's been robbed. That guy's the offender, he did the crime. You're a police officer, yes I am. Let's all put you together because we've got everyone we need for restorative justice, and if it doesn't work, fine, but let's see if it works first. Even with that, there's another issue, and that's the failure of many jurisdictions to consistently provide post-sentencing restorative justice. With only this approach, it's one of the biggest hindrances to successful integration. Essentially, as we know, restorative justice does work. There are statistics all over the place saying it can be very effective, but to most hearts and minds, a prisoner should be punished, they should not be healed. And that is the genuine truth that we feel hand on heart hand on Bible, whatever you choose to derive your truths from. With that being said, our dear friends the Belgians have come up with a solution to even this issue that exists within communities and counties. They have basically set out a strategy where every prison offers restorative program offers programs on restorative justice, as long as there is the incentive to participate, and that successful results will lead to early parole and early release. So basically, if you're willing to be involved in the process of restorative justice, your sentence could be shortened and you could be allowed to leave sooner. That's how they encourage more of the prisoners, anyway, to be involved in the process. And it's fortunate that the government itself is trying to make clear its efforts to bring restorative justice into widespread use within the prison system, and that they want to make a change. There was a speech by the Prime Minister which highlighted a startling figure that over 70% of prisoners are not first-time reoffenders, but 6 or 7 times reoffenders. That is a disgraceful figure. You could almost call these offenders professional prisoners. The prison system is literally a revolving door for these people. They go in, they serve their time, they go out, they do crime, they go back in, serve time, come out again, they get caught. What we're being told is the solution to this is to be harsher. Leave them in there longer, let them rot, punish them in other ways. That's not the solution. If anything, that's what we've been doing for the last few hundred years. And all it has led to now, as we have grown harder and tougher on crime, is more and more darker feelings and emotions towards prisoners and greater reoffending, as they do not feel part of the larger community. They feel almost institutionalized within these prisons. If we are to solve the problem of reoffending, we must find a way of bringing these prisoners back into larger society, of accepting they have done a crime but they have served their time. Just as if you smashed someone else's vase and you got them a new one, would you not want to feel that you should be forgiven? A prisoner is someone who goes there to prove they have done wrong, but to serve their time and to learn, so that when they come out they have done something right. The solution is two-pronged. The prison needs to fully integrate restorative justice because it works, and society needs to become more forgiving. I remember talking to one of my friends in the street, and I said to them, you know, the government have agreed once more to a blanket charge on all criminals, that no one can be treated differently, that even someone who steals a bottle of water should be treated the exact same as someone who breaks into your house and maims your children. That was done, I think, 2015. It's been quite a long time since that sort of discussion went through Parliament, but in the situation, Britain has been one of the few countries where we treat all criminals basically the same, where one type of crime, irrelevant of the circumstances, has more or less the same sentence. Most other countries have a difference on this topic and on how prisoners have reacted or acted. Either way, when I spoke to my friend, I said to him, what do you think of a prisoner? You know, what do you think they deserve to walk among us? And he turned around and he said to me, no, prisoners are terrible people. They are bad people. They have committed a crime. They can never be forgiven. They will never get better. They will never improve. They should serve the rest of their lives in prison. I said, would you have a prisoner worked with you if they had served their time? He said, no. I don't want one of them working with me. How would I ever trust them? How would I ever believe that one day they wouldn't just snap on me and do something to me, or something much to this effect? And that's the problem we face in society. Look around you. Are criminals that different from the people we know? Are there not people who casually mistreat others, who do things which are in some ways just as bad, and yet we see them as equals, we allow them to live their lives, and we do not come after them and hound them in the same way that a prisoner who is the same sort of person but has served their time? We treat them all the same. I think the easiest difference is, imagine someone who embezzles. Now, an embezzler is the same as the burglar who breaks into your house. Now, the burglar, it's a more direct impact. They've come into your property, they've disturbed your life, and they've made you feel less secure, and they've taken from you. But an embezzler, they'll never see your face. They'll never see the harm that they have done. They will never know the cause of all their crimes. They will merely take from the shadows because they have no courage. And they will serve their time, and then when they come back out, because embezzling is not seen in the same light as a burglar, they will have another job if they so require, because services are a lot easier to be worked in than non-services. And that's the real shameful thing about all this, that even when we talk about these reoffenders, perhaps it is that some are not capable of our white-collar and blue-collar crimes, and for them there is a different rule book. And we need to forgive, forget, turn the other cheek. Is that not what Christ said? Perhaps we too must do the same. Be willing to give someone who feels and seems generally repentant a second chance. Now, you could say that one of the main reasons why there's so much reoffending is because for a prisoner, being in society, you probably have less freedoms than when you are out of it. Think of it this way. When you are in prison, you have your 3 square meals a day. They give you lunch, they give you breakfast, they give you dinner. You have your time in the yard, you can do your workouts in their semi-gyms, you go back to your rooms. After they banned book reading and brought it back, you can now read books. And you can have a fairly comfortable life and not have to worry too much. And maybe you do some wood tech, maybe you can build something in your spare time, give something to the community. But ultimately, you live a life not too dissimilar from those who are on the outside. It's just your cage is a little bit smaller than theirs. Most people who work will spend time going to and from their work every day, a slave to their job, a prisoner to their situation, and a slave to the money they must earn. But think of a prisoner like this. Once they leave prison, they are to be watched. It's as if they never left. When they go for jobs, most jobs will say, do you have a criminal record? And if you do, you're gone. No job for you. Because in our cutthroat society, it doesn't matter what skills you have, it doesn't matter if you served your time, if you're no longer a prisoner. The fact that you once were means you can be again. And so we don't forgive, which is sad. A lot of prisoners are starting to make up for this. A lot of them are becoming entrepreneurs, starting their own bakeries, doing things that are a bit softer, a bit nicer, where they won't feel stressed, where they won't get angry, where they won't turn into what they were. Because they're not getting that help from us, from society. We just see all prisoners as the same. Now imagine if you know someone who might have once had a criminal record, a long time ago, over 20 or 30 years. Most criminal records aren't wiped after a certain period of time. There are some crimes that stick around on it. That can cause you major problems on your DBS or whenever you apply for a future job. For those people, it's just as bad. They have done something a long time ago. They've not done anything again for a very long time. They have served the community, society. They've done the right things. And yet they're still being treated, punished for what they've done. They might as well go back to prison. At least in there they'll get some respect for what they've done. At least in there people will understand, you committed a crime, but we might be different, but we might treat you the same based on how you act here. Anyway, we were talking about solutions. At the heart of restorative justice, it's this idea of forgiveness. It's the idea that you need to be positive and move forward, but to do it in a meaningful way. There are moves to provide restorative justice within prisons, but that's just a one-stage solution. For restorative justice to truly be effective, there must be an exemption to current laws that make released criminals a second-class citizen. This needs to be adjusted. In England and Wales, we need to stop thinking of released offenders as criminals in rebate, similar to how those who have gone to asylums, when they are released, they are not treated as cured, but as merely in recession or rescission, some fancy word like that. Prisoners are treated the same. You've got to also remember, if you've left prison, most of the time you can't vote for 5 years. 5 years. You've come back to society, and it takes you 5 years before you can prove that you are worthy of deciding your own government. Rather than being, what prison should really be is, we'll take you out of society, but as soon as you come back, everything's restored as if you had never gone to prison. Because you've served your time, you've done what you had to do. If prison was truly the punishment and the only punishment, that's how the system would work. But it doesn't work like that. It's almost like if you break the rules of society, then even when you return, you must go above and beyond to prove you're worthy of society. And even then, we're not going to give you a chance until you have really lasted the test of time. And most people can't. Most prisoners can't operate like these long-term, I must prove forever that I am evil, but now I'm trying to do good, and somehow in that period of time find a job from someone who's willing to take on a prisoner and not mistreat them because of the bad situation they're already in. We really need to treat them as returning citizens. There need to be special privilege for prisoners who are involved with restorative justice, such as the full reinstatement of their citizen liberties and the means to integrate within society, oyster cars, shelter work, these sort of things. I know from my own time when I was working for the Prisoners' Advice Bureau, the Prisoner Advice Unit, that there was some cases that came to our attention where prisoners who had actually been classed as no longer a threat were trying very hard to be reconsidered as a threat. Now, the reason why they wanted to do this is there's actually a lot more support available to prisoners who had been labelled as a threat to society than there were for those who were no longer a threat. It was really quite remarkable. For those who were no longer considered a threat, they were almost slung out on their ear. They were thrown into the cold, hard realities and said, you must find a home on your own, you must find somewhere to stay, find your own work. But if you were considered a far more, shall we say, dangerous person in community, you were given your own place to stay. You were given a sort of stable allowance and you were helped to find a job. How is it that the more worse offenders, more work was done for them to get into society than those who could have far more easily integrated with society? These lesser offenders, these non-problematic people. Now, I know we have to work very hard to get the greater offenders to reintegrate with society, but that doesn't mean that we should abandon those in between. Just because someone has a greater chance of integrating with society, it doesn't mean that we should leave them to somehow fend for themselves, when after so long we've deprived them of almost anything that would enable them to indeed fend for themselves successfully. That's one of the problems. Either way, essentially, you could even have treated these ex-cons as, job seekers. I mean, I know job seekers themselves has changed since 2013. It's not the same. Now it's all loans. You're not really being helped out by the government. You are borrowing from the government and from society, even though it was you who perhaps paid these taxes in the first place. Who's to say? Anyway, so there are plans for restorative justice for 2018. This is our forward-thinking head here. So the government has made it evidently clear in their latest restorative justice action plan how they intend to address some of the issues outlined above concerning restorative justice in 2018. The message is, generally speaking, a positive one. There is moves for full integration of restorative justice procedures at all stages, and there to be no bias placed against the offender or the crime. Much of the action plan has already been achieved, with the remaining stages being full integration and the creation of a quality assurance branch of the restorative justice courts that will be involved with specialised training for facilitators. Now, I say this, however, what we need to remember is it's now late into 2017, we're approaching 2018, and to a great extent there's a lot of problems already existing in Britain, and we're hearing a lot of talks already that once more we need to be harder on crime. So I will need to go back and check on this, but as far as I am aware from my time serving to help prisoners become members of society again, this was not the case. They were not receiving this sort of help, and as far as I'm aware, magistrate courts do not fully integrate the system either. There's no focus on restorative justice first. Perhaps community sentencing is used, but restorative justice certainly not that widely, certainly not in London. Now we need to consider that in the Criminal Justice and Courts Act of 2015 under section 43 and to 45 there is mention of our referral orders. Now that is to amend a previous limitation that existed within the Legal Aid, Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act 2012, which actually prevented the repeated use of referrals that promote restorative justice conferencing. It was a bit weird. I guess they were saying if it didn't really work to begin with, there's no point trying it repeatedly to see if it does work. Which is, financially speaking, probably you could see where they're coming from. They don't want to throw away money on something that didn't work the first time. However, if you just give up, there's always a chance that it might work. And for every successful prisoner, that's probably worth a lot more than we consider. I mean, we know, for example, prisoners are supposedly, they cost £40,000 a year to keep them in prison. However, that's just having them in prison. We're not talking about the benefits of them being outside and contributing to the community. If one of these fellows were contributing to the community, if they were volunteering their time, that could be a massive help to children, to adults. If they were an educator, perhaps they're providing future generations. You can never really know what the value of someone being on the outside who doesn't offend could be compared to someone who is offending. Now, while it's, there's evidence to suggest that restorative justice is becoming more integrated, especially since 2013, there was an additional clause that impacted restorative justice, especially among youth offenders. It's a clause that makes restorative justice contracts harder to break, so that rather than an offender receiving a custodial sentence on immediate breach, they are instead fined. Which is, it shows there's more of a focus on reparation rather than detainment, which was the main focus of the law before 1998. So now, even if you do breach your terms of restorative justice, essentially, say the agreement was you would paint your neighbour's garage because you broke into it last week and that's what you're being charged for. And then for one day you decided not to paint the garage, so it's an incomplete job. The courts can just fine you rather than just saying, right, look, he didn't do it, let's put him in prison. This is just a nicer way of dealing with it. The final points we'll get into here is, while restorative justice... Oh, I skipped a page, sorry there. Jeez Louise, I'm getting bad. Okay, I skipped ahead a bit. So, as the current action plan transitions are on track, it is likely within the next 2 years the desired full integration of restorative justice will be achieved. Whether the over 90,000 prison population will feel the results of the integration is questionable. Indeed, it is concerning that the action plan becomes ambiguous and vague on what steps will be taken after March 2016 to achieve full integration. Although this might relate to the EU referendum, so perhaps the government has different policies on how to implement restorative justice outside the EU as opposed to inside the EU, and are holding off until they can be certain of the result. Now, while I'm saying all this, again, we're getting close to 2018 now. in that time period, there have been prison riots, there have been prison breakouts, there's been known records of a lot more of these private prisons where it's not their aim to reduce reoffending. In fact, if you own a private prison, you gain your money from prisoners being there. So you want more prisoners. You don't want programs that will help them return to society. And that's a really terrible thing for us to have in Great Britain. We already had problems with reoffending. Why have we made it even easier for programs that could change this very problem from being implemented? Why is this massive idea that if we privatize everything, if we create a system where people want to make more money, that somehow these people who want to make more money will provide a social good? It doesn't make any sense. It's beyond reason that they believe this works. And the fact that the prison riots took place because there wasn't enough staffing in the prison should go to show how much prisons are willing to cut costs and cut corners just to eke out the most amount of money they can. Now, I've been reading a guy called Edward Deming quite recently, and he works on quality and how focusing on quality can solve a lot of the problems that we face in industry and society, and how it doesn't actually matter whether a system is run by the public sector or the private sector. As long as quality is the focus, you can get a better result. The fact that the public sector ran into problems because it wasn't so well, it had one aspect of quality existed, but another aspect wasn't there, and that was the efficiency. Now we are private sector in most places. We've lost the quality aspect, and the efficiency is not really there either, because it didn't come with the quality, it just came with cutting corners. So there's a lot of poor, really, one of the biggest problems we're facing here is a lot of government, a lot of decisions that are being made for our back pocket. And when money is your focus, you actually start losing money because you don't get enough of what is necessary. There is an actual important thing to note. When Michael Gove was the Lord Chancellor, he didn't really get involved with the affairs of the judges and cutting their spending. In fact, he actually focused on prison rehabilitation. Being that he was previously the education minister, he believes that education could have been the way forward for prisoners, and he tried to integrate a lot of programs to educate prisoners. However, like I've been saying earlier, the problem is not to do with education. Yes, that's what got a lot of these people into prison in the first place. Perhaps they weren't the most educated, perhaps they couldn't get a job, and in some cases they were the most educated. They had the jobs, but they saw an opportunity and they abused it. Whatever situation got them into prison, once they leave, that previous status is going to be the biggest obstacle to them succeeding in life. If any Lord Chancellor of the future is to make a difference in prison reoffending rates, that's one of the first things that need to be addressed. The opinion and view of prisoners. We can train them all we want, but if at the end of the day your piece of paper and your knowledge doesn't prevent you getting a job because you were a prisoner, if no matter how educated you are, you're not educated enough that it can somehow overshadow your prison status, then you're still, at the end of the day, you're in problems. You'll just go back to criminal activities. One interesting example I'd like to give, because we're moving quite close to the conclusion now, is in Norway they actually have an island. Now, I can't remember the name, I do apologise, but on this island it's very much similar to Restorative Justice. The ship that takes visitors to the island is run by basically prisoners. The people living on the island are prisoners. The workers in the stores are prisoners. If you can imagine, a prison is a giant cage. This island is an even bigger cage. However, on this island, prisoners can live in a community. They can own stores, they can apply their crafts, they can build bikes, they can cycle around. They're not allowed things like cars, They're not allowed a lot of the devices that you might find in society these days. However, they are allowed to live a life and to act like people within a society, within a community. It's a privilege to be involved in this program. If you are involved, it shortens your sentence. A lot of people who are low-scale offenders might serve 6 or 7 years, and then they're told, okay, because of your good behaviour, you have a choice to serve your last 1 or 3 years on this island. If you choose to, obviously we'll shorten your sentence, and it'll be a better way of life. And for those who do work on the island, they are paid, not as much as if they had a full-time job. Basically, it's their wages without tax being involved. So they are doing things. They're able to have like chocolate bars and a lot of the luxuries and comforts you couldn't find in a prison. It's, if you will, think of it as a stage before going straight to society. If society is a swimming pool and it's the deep, society is the deep end, prison is the shallow end, this island is the bit in between. This is, you're just learning how to swim. You can still stand if you need to, you're not going to drown, but you can learn to swim on your own. In the shallow end, you can swim around, but you're basically on the floor, so you won't be able to grow as much as you could if you had more space to swim. And if you grab someone straight out the shallow end without rubber dinghies or anything, and you just toss them in the deep end with the old sink or swim approach, that's what our current system is between prison and society. People are just taken out of prison, they take off their rubber dinghies and they throw them into the water and say, okay, we've given you an education if you bothered to learn it. If you haven't, oh well, now you're going to have to learn how to swim. But don't worry, if you can't swim, we can always put you back in the shallow end. And that's the return you to prison policy. Now, when we talk about the cost benefit this could have for England and Wales, this is an area deserving some form of mention. If restorative justice was integrated on a far wider scale, more based on the cost of the original pilot, which was reported, there was a reported saving of 185 million, or 185 million can be saved across all jurisdictions, compared to the combined cost of reoffending. How I worked this out at any rate was, I looked at how many people how much was the cost of integrating the whole program, then I minused off the number of people who the program, you could say, saved, prevented from going to prison, the benefit they gave. Now, I couldn't come up with a numerical figure for the benefit that they provided to communities, but I could come up with a numerical figure of how much on average they would save, since most of the restorative justice cases had related to our middle area crimes like burglary, and burglary tends to have a sentencing period between 3 and 6 years depending on good behaviour. I went with the middle figure, something closer to 4 or 5 years. I worked out the cost for one prisoner for 4 or 5 years, looked at how many from the full figure of those who were involved in the programme, how many did not reoffend, who perhaps had a history of reoffending, times that, transplanted it onto the figure of how many people are in prison and will be coming out of prison in the next few years, worked out based on the reoffender rates and the percentage drop that could occur, the savings would be 185 million, while the costs would be a real minority of that. I think the major problem that we often face with a lot of these government decisions over money making and money loss is they look at the short term, they go, okay, how much does it cost for us to do that? Not what are the results, what are the cost savings in the future. For example, if you had lower reoffending rates, one of the cost savings is obviously going to be these people who could have been in prison won't be in prison. So that's money you would have had to have spent ordinarily, now you don't. So if we were saying 70% of people reoffend, and then after this program's implemented, only 60% reoffend, Then we work out how much that 10% would be, how much roughly that would cost a year, and then say, right, that's money we have saved. Rather than saying, oh, this is how much it currently costs, if we don't do restorative justice, it will still cost the same amount in future. That's not going to be the case. If reoffending rates remain at 70%, there are always new criminals. That's what I think this statistic doesn't really account for. New people, if you're saying, let's say about 5,000 new criminals come into the system every year. If we're saying that 70% of people reoffend, then that means 3,500 perhaps of those criminals will be back next year. And that's on top of another 5,000 entering the system. So almost you have an ongoing stream of more and more and more and more people, especially if the population increases, you're going to get more and more and more and more. And that's going to be a massive loss. And never in any of the statistics have I seen is there any consideration of what is the value that can also come from prisoners who were able to be fully integrated in society. So let's just say for a moment an ex-prisoner who was costing you 40,000 a year. Say we integrate them into society. Say they become an actual worker making the minimum wage, the standard average for the year, £21,000 a year. They are no longer a loss to the system. In fact, they are making the system 61,500 a year now. How do we work this out? Think of it this way. 40,000, straight away that's wiped because they're not a prisoner anymore. So there's no costs involved for keeping them in prison. They're earning 21,000. They're going to want to spend that. They'll have to spend that on rent. There you go. You've just provided income to someone who will be renting them a house or even council. They will be paying taxes because they're not inside prison. Prisoners tend not to pay taxes because they're not earning anything. When you're outside, you're earning something. That means taxes. That means more money coming back into Great Britain's coffers. More money coming back to the community. Some of these people may be volunteering. That's work that would have otherwise gone undone. The benefits of those activities can be taken. If a prisoner was volunteering in a garden centre, or if they were volunteering in a park, every shrubbery they cut back, every field they make more available, that's more area for people to enjoy. That enjoyment is reflected in our society. If we have a more accepting and forgiving society, if we have more kind actions, then the benefits far exceed what we believe to be the costs. What we must always know is when you save one man or one woman, what is the true value of that act? Think of it. Bill Gates made an absolute fortune. He's an absolute billionaire. What would have happened if Bill Gates had been imprisoned? If because of his status as prisoner, he was never able to work for IBM, never able to start up the business he started up, never able to do anything, never able to reach the echelons that he has reached. There's prisoners probably out there like that. People who have in them the ability to innovate, who have in them the ability to be hard workers, who have in them the ability to become a functional member of society. But it is us who won't extend the hand. We are the ones who are creating the wheel. We are perpetuating the cycle. Now Brexit has occurred. We are being told we need to focus on our people like we have never done so before. What this government's plans have suggested leads me to feel shame and indignation at my own people because they are not enough. It is almost as if they have ignored the problems that Brexit has told us we have faced. Problems that, just so we are aware, always existed. Brexit has not made them suddenly emerge. They have always been there. There's been a fallen standard over the years. It's not tightening of education that will solve it. There needs to be better forms of education. People must become more aware. Working hard just for some exam doesn't make you a better worker, doesn't make you a better person. Prisoners who are forced to reoffend and reoffend and reoffend, you need to break the wheel. We need to break the cycle. We need to start thinking about the solutions and not about the problems. Start thinking about the long term and not the short. There is a problem in this country. Now, there are statistics that says university students, there's about 25,000 a year less going to university. Originally the papers were saying 1 in 5 people will be going to university. That is wrong. That is not what the statistics are showing. They're showing falling rates. They're showing that since prices have increased, people are not committing to that. Maybe there's more apprentices now. Maybe the figure does not adequately represent apprentices. But what we certainly know is it will never represent prisoners. Now, I don't know personally about any prisoners who are allowed to go to university. I know that perhaps you will be prevented from getting a student loan if you had a criminal record. Problems like this are preventing our solutions. It is this internalized, real discrimination that's going on. Prisoners are people. They are any colour, they are any race, they are any possibility. Any one of us has within us the potential to become a criminal, to commit a crime. But knowing that once you have done it, there is no going back. There is no living a better life. Why would you even try to live within society when you are hated, when you are mistreated, when there is no future for you? And so prisoners often reoffend. Some are strong, warranted, are supported, and will try their hardest, and will try hard for others. I have read about so many movements in America, not so much in the UK, but in America certainly, where prisoners are actually starting their own enterprises, and they refuse to hire anyone who is a non-criminal. They actually hire criminals because they know it's harder for them. There's not that many programs like that in the UK. And we still have the exact same problem of mistreating those who have repented. Anyway, looking back at those statistics that we deviated from so long ago, the pilot made clear that without incorporating these predicted costs, reoffending as a result of restorative justice costs slightly more than the normal court case. So restorative justice is a bit more expensive than running a magistrate court case, probably because the magistrate is free. But then again, we don't know all the hidden costs. One of the things I always have found a problem with when doing research on topics like this is the amount of hidden costs, you could say, that are never actually quantified and provided. You know, it's like when the council comes out with it and says, oh yeah, we have had loads of meetings, and in 1 year we spent £60,000 on hobnobs or something like that, on biscuits, basically, for their meetings. What that doesn't tell you is, that tells you one thing, or perhaps two, that there have been a lot of council meetings, and clearly there have been an absolutely large amount if you spent that much on biscuits. Perhaps too many council meetings, not enough solutions. A lot of people say, oh, the concern is they spend too much on the biscuits, they should cut away with the biscuits. Maybe what they should cut away with is a lot of useless meetings, because if you're spending that much on cookies, how much are you spending to pay these people for these council meetings, you know, if they're not really achieving anything? I do remember talking to councillors who would say sometimes you come up with a good idea, but just because it came from one party, another party would disagree entirely because they thought, right, we can't show anything good coming from them, it must only come from us, and that kind of infighting meant that there was more council meetings, nothing was done, and things only got done if you had widespread one-party dominance. It's just silly. It really was. Anyway, a lot of the current research I looked at for this paper actually proves that the costs were lower. And that was applicable in Northern Ireland, that was applicable in Scotland, according to the last statistics that they reported. And from the Welsh police force, restorative justice was also used there, but it was on a far smaller scale. They only spent, I think, £94,000, but they had estimates that it could save them £850,000. That's a massive amount that can be saved. Now, at the moment, there is simply not enough information on the cost involved with restorative justice within England and Wales to discuss any more about its cost effectiveness, and I'm really angry about that. I honestly am very upset that there's been so much focus on these short-term gains and these, oh, it worked in the past, so it's going to do it again. Unwillingness to try something new, unwillingness to document it. It's the exact same issue with quality assurance and running businesses. Deming always said, in his area of expertise, he said, how you can make a company work better is less competition and more, cooperation. We work together. If my department says got the jobs done first, that doesn't necessarily mean that we had the same amount of work as another department. Perhaps we had people who specialised, so could get it done quicker. Perhaps we knew our trade and got it done. For some, not all jobs are made equal. Some jobs will take 50 minutes, some will take 30 minutes. And for that reason, perhaps departments should be willing to help each other rather than saying, oh, I got all the job done. Now I'm just going to pretend I have no work. I'm still doing work for the whole day, because if I show that I've done something, they'll just make me do something else, or they'll just, that doesn't need to be done. That's one of the problems we face here. Restorative justice is exactly the same. It's a system that has worked elsewhere, but for some reason, the politicians are unwilling to say it can work here. No one's willing to stand up. No one who is really a big authority figure. I've never heard, for example, and this is really dating us now, I've never heard Theresa May, I've never heard Corbyn, I've never heard Vince Cable, who's current leader of the Lib Dems. God knows if that will remain the same. I haven't heard any of these leaders ever say, you know what, or any of the shadow chancellors either, restorative justice could save us money. I never heard them saying, we pay more to save more. This is exactly the same as the issue with the UK interstate. But anyway, we are starting to once more deviate because of this cost issue. Let's go to the conclusion, because you've been sitting here for quite a while. So in conclusion, there can be no question that in the past, England and Wales was not a place where restorative justice could be integrated. Certainly as long as public policy reflected a hard line on crime, this couldn't have been the case. Yet, rhetoric has given way to the overwhelming evidence that's built up in Northern Ireland, who first used restorative justice, and then by the restorative justice pilot scheme in England and Wales. The current message being put out by the government is that there are increasing uses of restorative justice, that more research is being made available about how it can be integrated, that generally speaking there is also a progressive shift in media coverage of restorative justice, and it's fair to say that it is being integrated. There are still some hurdles that need to be overcome. Least of all is the need for greater participation from the populace and more effective laws, but it is certainly clear that in England and Wales anyway, we're going in the same direction as Northern Ireland and Scotland. In addition, this whole topic I've talked about has only touched upon the reduced cost associated with restorative justice. Other forms of sentencing in England and Wales, due to a lack of research in the field following the 2008 report, only shows that there needs to be a lot more research on this topic in order to provide a far more concise idea about how we can restore, how the practices can be done. Now, that's me essentially concluding it, but obviously there was a lot of work that went into this, originally this topic. I did write the first essay on this, let's count back the months. In 2000 and... It was either 2016 in the month of April, or I wrote this in 2015 in December. It's something I did 2 years ago, basically. So now I can actually look back and see what kind of changes occurred. You know what, I'm going to... Alright, so from what's going on here? A check of the figures, and I found a rather useful Hansard report, if you will, from one of my local MPs, the MP for Bromley, a Conservative minister, and they were discussing, this was released 2017 in January, if you believe, and they talked about the figures for this year and the years previously. Essentially, in the period from 2015 to 2016, £29 million was made available to police and crime commissioners for restorative justice, and this was protected money, by the way, from an overall £63 million, which is now being allocated from 2016 to 2017. However, what is rather unfortunate is, despite the amount of money being provided, the percentage shows that between 2013 and 2016, only 4.2% of cases were referred to restorative justice. What this means is, while there is an even greater commitment by the government and even a financial commitment, which is wonderful, among the police force, among those who deal with these cases at the magistrate's level perhaps, there has not been a general uptake in restorative justice, which is really quite surprising. I might revisit this essay at some point in the future and rewrite something a bit more for modern times with modern realizations. However, as far as the report was going, it was looking at 2020 to 2021 and trying to get the government to be even more committed financially to doing this. I'm trying to work out, based on the action plans, if there was, if they have recorded any financial gains from this involvement. But we can say, with 4.2 being referred, does that necessarily mean that this is 4.2 taken out of the system? If it is, then you have to give me another second to try and work out how many prisoners went in. Oh my. Okay, hold on. To this very same report, some very interesting information has been provided. Essentially, there were concerns over the domestic abuse cases. Remember, I spoke earlier on about there's some situations where restorative justice probably is not going to be effective at all, and that is where a woman perhaps has been abused by her husband. Obviously, you don't want to see them again, and restorative justice is being recommended. Now, even in that early pilot scheme in 2008, they said, these sort of cases, very much not recommended. Do not do it with these cases. According to the MPs on this matter, there are statistics to show that, in fact, police were doing the opposite, that more often than not, they were recommending this sort of result for domestic abuse cases, which is quite terrible. Starkly terrible. The worst, what one minister said is, this is what one minister was told by a women's abuse clinic. This is just another way of the perpetrator continuing their abuse. I'm going to read a little further down into the report and get back to you. Alright, so from what I've read, because I did a further reading of the same Hansard from January 2017, some really interesting information. One is that there's currently another pilot going on into the effectiveness of restorative justice within England and Wales, and that pilot should conclude in autumn, so we'll know a lot more about this topic by then, so perhaps we'll be able to revisit it again. As far as the ministers concerned on this, which were largely Labour and Conservative ministers who were in the discussion, there, as well as the Commissioner for Victims and the Commissioner for Justice, there was a lot of talk about how effective it is overseas, how a lot of people are happy that here we're focusing again on this domestic policy, that some ministers are very much concerned restorative justice has not been implemented in prisons well at all, and they believe that is because of staff shortages and other problems, safety problems that exist within prisons right now, and they think these need to be addressed first. But even so, there needs to be more work by governors to try and introduce restorative justice as a post-prison operation, which I'm very glad to read about, because again, that's something I said needs to be done more of in this country. The number that says only 4.2% of people are being referred to restorative justice against all of the ministers present found that to be rather appalling. They thought that was, this is something that really is very effective in lowering reoffending rates, and the fact that so few were able to do it is a great loss for the country. They said that they worked out how much of that 29 million that had been allocated between 2013 and 2016 was actually spent. The question was asked by the Labour Minister. He said, this 63 million you spoke of which some of it's gone to restorative justice, that money is not actually ring-fenced, it's a general grant. So how much money has actually been allocated to restorative justice? Can you give us an exact figure? The minister, after a while, was able to give a figure. Unfortunately, of the 29 million that was supposedly given to restorative justice, actually 11 million was spent on restorative justice. So that brings to mind another problem. So only 4.2% actually had their case referred, which meant this small minority got even less money than had been set out originally. That means at least 18 million more pounds could have been spent on more restorative justice cases. It was just a situation of not enough people were doing it, even with the small numbers. And what I saw the whole way through is no official statistics or estimates about how much people believe has been saved. One Labour MP who had been working in Northern Ireland on just this same issue with some of his fellow Conservative ministers was able to put forward his own sort of estimate of savings. He said, if you think of it like this, for every £1 spent on restorative justice, you save £8 in people not reoffending and the other court fees. So if you get it right the first time, that means no more court cases in the future, no more reoffenders, no more of those escalating costs. And that's what he was alluding to. He was just saying, we can't put an exact figure on it at the moment, but let's just ballpark the figure at £1 spent means £8 saved. So that's the important thing. Really, the governments of the day need to stop considering the idea of, how much money do we have right now? Start thinking about how much money could we have in the future. If we spend now, what can we save? Not what are we losing in the moment. You can rebalance your books easy. You make an investment in one way this year, maybe you cut down your investments this year. However, by the next year, because you have spent well in the first year, you'll have more money freed up to solve your problem in the second year for your other areas. Essentially, get rid of a problem, invest in it, solve it, get rid of it, shelve it, onto the next one. If a problem is being dealt with effectively, its costs will never rise but will fall. This here, when we're saying you're at 4.2% of people given, this restorative justice, if we can get 100% restorative justice, well, not the domestic cases, but if we can get like 80% restorative justice, what that means is this year it might cost us 100 million, but next year there's less criminals, might cost us 80 million. You see? And as we get better at delivering the system, the cost as well will come down. Right now we're not specialised. We need additional training. We need to know how to implement the system. Once you know, once you're good, system becomes easier, we become better at doing it, our costs will fall. Of course, they'll reach a stage where they can fall no further, but that is what we're trying to set out to do. We're trying to set out a system that works, not a system that is penniless. Crime will always exist. Whether we are in a position to solve it is another matter. Now, I believe I can move on to the bibliography, now that we've covered just about everything. And as I said before, perhaps around the Christmas period, when this autumn release comes, if I am working with any restorative justice-like systems, I might look again into this issue. We might have a second roundup. That's something to look forward to, I imagine. Anyway, the bibliography for this one that was dated to 2016, so old news now. Statutes that were considered were the Crime and Courts Act of 2013, the Crime and Disorders Act of 1998, the Criminal Justice Courts Act of 2015, the Justice Northern Ireland Act of 1996, the Justice Northern Ireland Act of 2002, the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act 2012, the Offenders Rehabilitation Act of 2014. Of the secondary cases, because no court cases were considered in this discussion. On the secondary cases, we have government reports, normal reports, and reviews. We have the Criminal Justice Inspection Northern Ireland, their report on the effectiveness of youth sentencing, that's dated 2015. We have the Crown Prosecution Service in their Code of Practice for Victims of Crime. This is from the Ministry of Justice, 2013. We have the speech by David Cameron on prison reform at Prime Minister's speech. This is from the Prime Minister's Office, dated 2016. Unfortunately, we now have Theresa May, which might mean a change in situations. However, it appears she has left it to the minister to deal with. Another one we have, Gavin Berman and Alia Dar, Prisons Population Statistics. This is from the Commons Library 2013. HMIC, HMI Probation, HMI Prisons and HMC Criminal Prosecution Service. Facing up to offending, use of restorative justice in the criminal justice system, dated 2012. Jessica Jobson and Amy Kirby, Public Attitudes of Youth to Youth Crime, report on focus group research, 2012. Joanna Shapland, Anne Atkinson, Helen Atkinson, James, and so many others. Does restorative justice affect reconviction? That's from the MOJ 2008. Ministry of Justice again, pre-sentencing restorative justice, from there in 2014. Ministry of Justice proven reoffending statistics quarterly bulletin, April 2013 to March 2014 in England and Wales. That was seen 2016. Ministry of Justice restorative justice action plan for criminal justice period of March 2018. So forward thinking here. The next one, by the way, that is to be released is the plan for 2018 to 2021. The SARCO Annual Report 2013-2014. The SARCO Annual Review 2014-2015. The Crown Prosecution Service, simply put, Restorative Justice 2016. We also have the EU NGO Report. This is from Daniel Bolivia and others. This is the Victims and Restoration of Justice, an empirical study of the needs, experiences and positions of victims within restorative justice practices. We also have writings from NGOs. Again, Amy Kirby has appeared here with the evaluation of the pre-sentencing restorative justice pathfinder in 2015. This is from Restorative Justice Solutions, who, if you're not aware, is the organisation that is currently meant to be employed teaching restorative justice to prisons. We have the Independent Commission on Youth Crime 2008, Time for a Fresh Start. We have Jacob and Gibbs, Out of Trouble, Making Amends, Restorative Justice in Northern Ireland, dated 2009. We have the Restorative Justice Councils, a review of youth justice systems in Northern Ireland, Restorative Justice Council 2012. There's also the Restorative Justice Council, RJC, Response to Punishment and Reform, Effective Community Sentencing Consultation Paper 2012. There's Sherman L. and Shrang H. 2007. Their Restorative Justice, The Evidence, This was by the London Smith Institute. There's also the newspaper, the Herald Scotland. UK prison populations is the highest in the EU. That was dated 2016. We have journals now. Journals by Aaron Arthur and others. Reward, Motivation and Emotional Systems Associated with Early Stage Intense Romantic Love, 2005. This actually spoke about just this issue, which is, considering the title, it's not exactly clear, but it's basically on psychology, the most part, the emotional systems part anyway. Caroline Hoyle and Roxana Willis, The Challenge of Integrating Restorative Justice into the Deep End of Criminal Justice, 2016. Chris Kuninin and Baron Goldson, Restorative Justice, A Critical Analysis. Claire Hamilton and others, Punishment, Youth Justice and Cultural Contingency Towards a Balanced Approach, from the Youth Justice 2016. Dusterman, Kristen, others, The Effect of Local Crime on Mental Health, 2015. Jennings, Penal Populism and the Public Thermostat, Crime, Public Punitiveness and Public Policy, 2016. How has ethic diversity grown? Ethic, Identity and Inequalities in Britain, The Dynamics of Diversity, 2015. Kirkwood's Restorative Justice Cases in Scotland, Factors Related to Participation, 2009. David Omani, 2006, his Restorative Approaches, Young People, Youth Justice, from Chapter 8 of a certain edition that had journal stuff in it. Bros Bonetti, The Kindness of Prison Strengths-Based Resettlement in Theory and in Action, 2006. Simon Green's Restorative Justice in Transition, 2016. Susie Hooley, Ben Crew, others, Re-examining the Problem of Long-Term Imprisonment. That's from British Criminology in 2015. We also have the book by Hazel Correll, Crime, Justice and Society in Scotland, 2016. David O'Mahony again, O'Mahony, Restorative Justice and Youth Justice, bringing theory and practice closer together in Europe, from chapter 10. David again in 2016, Mainstream Restorative Justice for Youth Offenders through Youth Conferencing, the Experience of Northern Ireland, from chapter 14 there. Newburn 2009, his key readings on criminology, which was published in Devon, named simply Restorative Justice. We also have 2 blogs under consideration. The blog by Alex Cavendish, a previous prisoner, called Preparing for Prison, released in 2016, and another article by Alex Cavendish called Dixane Disasters, Wormwood, Scrubs. Again, this is on his website, Prison UK, from 2016. Now we've got nothing else. I was looking at all my pages. I think I accidentally printed this a second time. Anyway, that's everything. Well, thank you for listening, my dear humble friend, and we'll be back with another interesting discussion on another point of law and another topic of the law. Remember, we're not just limited to merely criminal or any of those. We are happy to go into sociology, we are happy to go into psychology, and indeed we might be revisiting restorative justice to see if it is still working in practice in England and Wales. Thank you.